What is the deal with the right wing claiming to be tough on crime? Where do they get this from? Where did it originate? Well, I'll tell you, it originated in the 60s, actually. It originated just before Richard Nixon took office, I would say. That's when it really became this big, energized political football. Richard Nixon was complaining about the Supreme Court's decision in Miranda versus Arizona, which, helped make sure that criminal defendants, people who are suspected of crimes, would have their constitutional rights vindicated, their Fifth Amendment rights, their Sixth Amendment rights. They'd be able to speak with an attorney. They wouldn't be able to get railroaded by police when they're in custody and being interrogated. And Nixon said, "This is terrible. This is soft on crime garbage." And then, he got elected and kept campaigning on being tough on crime. And then ironically, he needed to be pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford, a very moderate Republican and a guy who seems very reasonable compared to the likes of Donald Trump and George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. But yeah, he needed to get pardoned, basically, and that put a major stench on Ford's presidency. But yeah, Nixon was the original crime warrior. I would say that Reagan also helped revive a lot of that. Bill Clinton, too, was so scared about being labeled a soft on crime liberal. He was like, shoot, I don't want to get taken down like Michael Dukakis did. I don't want to be accused of being soft on crime. So it's time for me to sign this crime bill that was written by Joe Biden in 1994. And then Republicans continued to make a big stink about crime throughout Clinton's presidency, George W. Bush's presidency. And then Trump comes in there and starts saying all sorts of garbage, especially about, we need to give the death penalty to illegal immigrants who do things like shoplifting. He's actually said that. He said, or Kristi Noem said that we should send shoplifting illegal immigrants to Guantanamo Bay. So yeah, it's really reached a fever pitch lately. Republicans are going all in on it. And why? I mean, it's obviously cynical, but yeah, they need something to energize their base. They need people to make a boogeyman out of. And it's like, okay, criminals are a pretty easy group of people to do that to, because obviously a lot of crime, although not all crime, involves a victim. And we don't like seeing victimization of people in our society. Someone beats another person up on the street, someone mugs another person. Of course, the mugger and the person who beat someone up deserves to be punished. They deserve to be called out. They deserve to be put through the system, obviously given a fair trial. But we need to stamp out crime. It's an important thing. But I've talked about this before. They love focusing in on these news stories about crime and being like, look, this is what wokeness did. This is what being soft on crime did. People think they can get away with this. They do this in order to distract from the economic issues. And some really, really audacious right-wingers who are just, they're full of it, and they know how to use all sorts of fallacies. They'll say, poverty doesn't cause crime. Crime causes poverty. Oh, really? Interesting. So you mean that, all these people who are poor, they're just criminals? Yeah. They have themselves to blame. They committed crimes, so they just have to deal with it. As I've said before, this is another tactic to justify hierarchies, to say, no, they're not poor because the system sucks. They're not poor due to any flaw in the system. They're poor because they're criminals. They make bad decisions. They made bad spending decisions. They spent too much money on their cup of coffee and their avocado toast, and now they're committing crime, and so they have no one to blame but themselves. Of course, poverty can cause crime. Of course. But these people insist on not opening their eyes to reality. And I think the fact is they understand this. When you're suffering, you become more desperate. That's the unfortunate reality. Not every person who is suffering commits crime, obviously. Not every person who is well off will never commit a crime. There's white collar crime. There are super wealthy people who get charged with stuff like DUIs. They put their hand in the cookie jar. They think they're too special, and, they end up not getting away with it. I'm not saying that wealthy people are impervious to the criminal justice system, but what I am saying is that the criminal justice system favors the wealthy and disfavors the poor. And so the right-wingers see that the left, or at least the sincere leftists, the ones who are not, just like neoliberals who are like, I kind of like what Reagan and Bill Clinton did, and that was pretty cool. The actual serious leftists, not just socialists, but like people who are like, okay, we want to reform the system. They're saying there's a problem here. The rich seem to be screwing over the poor. They seem to be getting much more wealthy at the expense of the poor and the middle class, and that's very problematic. And so the right-wingers kind of know this is true. At least I suspect a good bit of them do. But they see the energy behind the leftist movement in terms of calling out corporate greed, calling out basically the class warfare that the rich, with the help of the Republican Party and some people in the Democratic Party, has been waging on the poor and the middle class. And they're like, shoot, we need something to get angry about too. And so you see all these YouTubers covering these crime stories and they're getting really mad. And they're like, oh, this is so horrible. Our culture has degraded so much. Culture, culture, culture. That's another thing. It gives them another opportunity to bellyache, to moan about culture, the decline in culture, because obviously nobody ever committed crime before when our culture was so good and pristine, and oh my gosh, when everything was so special, and all these different groups knew to stay in their place. Oh, they didn't. It's not. That's not the problem. No, these people. It's so obvious that they will use the bellyaching about crime as a way to basically justify, things were better before social progressivism existed. They're saying that, basically social progressivism is the cause of crime. And then, of course, crime causes poverty. And that gives them a new way to say, oh, yeah, it's actually leftism that's causing poverty. They say that, the soft on crime policies of the left are enabling crime. They're not being tough enough on people. Some of them are actually calling for the death penalty for crimes that are actually, not involving the death of another person. So most people agree, okay, if there's going to be a death penalty, it needs to be for something really, really egregious and disgusting. But some of these people are like, yeah, no, if you deface a monument or something, you should get the death penalty. Now, I get it. You think the monuments are cool, they're historic, they're precious. But these people are like, yeah, no, you're attacking all of society by doing that, so we should give you the death penalty. It's just plain fascistic. It just is. There are some people who say, oh, yeah, no, we need mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums, you can kind of understand the sentiment behind them. Like, okay, there should be a certain floor, but in reality, it's just taking discretion away from the judge to take into account mitigating circumstances behind a particular defendant. It's just saying, no, we need to be tough. We need to go after this. You need to do this. Take discretion away from the judge. Make it harder and harder for defense attorneys to negotiate a good deal with district attorneys who say, oh yeah, you know what, there were a lot of mitigating circumstances here. They say, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. You need to give them at least this type of sentence. And so that's really problematic. But the right wing utilizes this in order to deflect attention away from the wealthy. That's the general trend. And now, of course, there are exceptions to rules, but the exception does not disprove the rule. So yeah, I talk about wealthy people committing crimes. President Trump is an example of this. Just like Richard Nixon, President Trump could have probably used a pardon, but of course he didn't get pardoned. He was indicted on 34 felony counts. As some people will gleefully point out, they were very technical in nature. But at the same time, it's not like these are the only crimes he's committed. We know he's committed others. We know he hasn't been convicted for those other crimes. And in fairness, we know plenty of other politicians, including in the Democratic Party, have committed crimes and they've not been charged or convicted for them. But the first convicted felon president ends up being their guy who complains so much about crime, and yet he's committing crimes nearly every other day. Why is that? Why is that they're projecting so much? And he ran against, ironically, a prosecutor. So a lot of people thought that was a pretty hilarious feature of the election. But yeah, the idea too that Republicans constantly plummet crime when they take office and that they know how to fix it, I mean, it's nonsensical. But they do know how to run a good campaign in criticizing, Democrats, usually on fallacious grounds, saying, oh, you didn't support this super tough sentence, therefore this other crime, this unrelated crime that happened is a result of you. We need to punish people more to scare other people. Here's the thing. Would-be criminals are not looking at the news to see, oh, what happened to this person for breaking the law. They're not doing that. They're not reading the criminal statutes. That's just not happening. They're not looking at the mandatory minimums. So being super hardcore and draconian does not help fix crime. It just doesn't. Sorry. But respecting people's constitutional rights, that's an imperative. And so there's this weird conflict, this tension between the right and their support for being tough on crime as well as their support for the Constitution. They think, oh, well, the Constitution, it protects criminal defendants' rights. It seems like they really think that, okay, it only applies to criminal defendants who are, white and, considered, good, upstanding people. That's what they seem to think. They seem to think that, non-white people who are not wealthy, they're the dregs of society, and so the Constitution doesn't actually protect them. That's an argument they've actually made. They said the Constitution shouldn't apply to people that we don't consider to be Americans, and that's really concerning. But this brings me to the last point of, the oppression thing, the idea of subjugating marginalized groups, make it worse for them. So they justify the hierarchy. They say they're poor because they commit crime. And we can shove a bunch of police into their neighborhoods because they commit so much crime. Those losers. That's the idea. But they also, if you pay attention to these right-wing channels that talk about crime so much, these Law and Order channels, so many times you notice that they're hyperfixating on people of certain races in these videos. They're saying, look at this criminal, look at this crazy criminal. Sometimes they'll even just like point out their race too, just to like attack them. It's like, they're not even hiding it anymore. Back in 2015 and 2016, they did this whole kind of like colorblind thing, but now they're actually just going out and being like, yeah, no, you're from a different culture. You're a criminal culture. This is bad. This is not true American. You commit more crimes. Now, here's the thing though. People have pointed this out. U.S. citizens, natural-born U.S. citizens, commit fewer crimes, or I should say commit more crimes than both illegal immigrants and immigrants. Doesn't matter what their status is, they commit more crimes. And now, I'm not saying, oh, that means that, you know, immigrants are better people than Americans or anything like that. No, because I understand that, by the way, the amount of crimes you committed, it isn't an inherent reflection of your morality. Here's the thing. Just because something's illegal doesn't mean it's immoral. And just because something is immoral doesn't mean it should be illegal. For example, going over the speed limit, you can get cited for that. Obviously, it's not like a felony or anything, but if you go over the speed limit, even 1 mile per hour, does that make you an immoral person? No, not really. I wouldn't say so. You went 1 mile per hour over the speed limit. That's not immoral necessarily, but you can still get cited for that, understandably so. Now, on the other hand, let's think about something that is deeply immoral, but is not illegal. Adultery. Adultery used to be, you know, criminalized, but people don't really enforce those statutes anymore. But yeah, they understand that, okay, we're not going to interfere in people's bedrooms, you know, as disgusting as adultery is, as much as it makes you appear to be a complete and utter piece of garbage, you know, as hurtful as that is, as disloyal as that is, we're not going to be as authoritarian to, you know, crack down on what you do in the bedroom, even if it's bad, even if it's disloyal and despicable. We're not going to crack down on that. So again, enough with this idea that, you know, oh, poor people are just, you know, they're just criminals and, you know, that's why they're poor. Enough with that. Enough with this idea that, oh, someone committed crime, therefore they must be less of a human being. Therefore, oh, they should have the right to vote taken away. That's something they do too. I used to sort of think, oh, well, it's kind of understandable if you're a felon, you know, if you don't respect our laws, then you shouldn't be involved in voting for people who make our laws. But obviously the law gets stuff wrong too. Some laws are unjust. And so the idea that you're a convicted felon that justifies taking away your voting rights, no, voting is a very sacred, important thing. And it's not like a bunch of felons are going to get together and just sway elections, really. So let felons vote. Let anyone who reaches that age and wants to vote, let them vote. Simple as that. Let me know what you think in the comments below about the Republicans and their use of crime as an issue in elections. Why do they purport to be tough on crime? Please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. This is the more the merrier, and I look forward to speaking to you in my next video.